Have you ever smiled through something that quietly hurt your feelings because you didn't want to make a big deal out of it? Have you ever started wondering if your place in your own family was slowly changing without anyone saying it out loud? Have you ever walked away from someone you loved, telling yourself you were just overthinking things, even though your heart kept saying otherwise? My husband and I bought our house more than 40 years ago. We raised our son there, celebrated birthdays there, and filled every room with memories. After my husband passed away, the house felt quieter, but it still felt like home. A year later, my son and his wife moved in with me while they saved money for a place of their own. I was happy to have the house full again. When my grandchildren were born, helping became part of my everyday life. Some mornings, I made pancakes before the kids woke up. Other days, I stopped by the grocery store because my daughter in law had texted that they were out of milk or diapers. I never counted the money, the babysitting, or the favors. They were my family, and I never thought I needed to. Lately, though, little things had started to feel different. I couldn't explain why. Conversations ended when I walked into a room. Decisions seemed to get made without me. Every time I noticed it, I told myself I was imagining things. Then one Friday afternoon, I pulled into the driveway with two heavy grocery bags in my hands. Before I could reach the front door, my daughter in law stepped outside. She smiled, but it wasn't her usual smile. "Mom," she said, "you don't need to come today. We've got everything under control." I stood there for a second, still holding the bags. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. "Go home and get some rest." Even my son smiled and gave me a small wave from the kitchen window. I looked down at the grocery bags. My grandson's favorite cereal was sticking out of one of them. I quietly carried the bags back to my car and drove away. Maybe they simply wanted an evening to themselves, but deep down, something didn't feel right. It wasn't just what she had said. It was how easy it had been for her to say it. A few days later, I stopped by the house to return my grandson's jacket after he had left it in my car. I only meant to leave it by the front door and head home. But before I knocked, I heard my daughter-in-law laughing inside with one of her friends. Then I heard a sentence that made me freeze where I was standing. I stood there without making a sound. The front door was only slightly open, and their voices carried through the hallway. My daughter-in-law laughed and said, "Honestly, it finally feels like our place." Her friend laughed too. Then came the words that made my stomach drop. "We live here now." For a second, I wondered if I'd heard her wrong. I waited for my son to say something, even one sentence. I told myself he would remind her whose house it really was. But all I heard was his quiet laugh from somewhere inside the living room. That silence hurt more than her words. I quietly laid my grandson's jacket on the porch chair. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. My hands were shaking so much that I dropped my keys before I could unlock the door. The drive home felt longer than it ever had. I kept hearing the same sentence over and over. "We live here now." That night, I walked into my bedroom and opened the old wooden dresser my husband had built years before he passed away. At the very bottom was a blue folder covered with dust. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years. The house deed was still there. So was a note my husband had written not long before he died. It said, "No matter what happens, this house will always be your safe place." I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that note with both hands. Suddenly, little moments from the past few months came rushing back. My husband's favorite chair had quietly disappeared from the living room. Family pictures had been replaced with newer ones where I wasn't even included. The small room where I kept my sewing things had slowly turned into a storage room without anyone asking me. None of those moments had seemed important by themselves. Together, they told a very different story. For the first time, I stopped asking myself if I was imagining things. I wasn't. The problem wasn't one sentence. That sentence simply made me see everything else I had been trying not to notice. I wiped my eyes, picked up my phone, and looked at one name in my contacts for a long time before pressing the call button. It wasn't my son. It was the lawyer who had helped my husband and me buy that house more than 40 years earlier. My lawyer answered on the second ring. After I explained everything, he was quiet for a few seconds before asking one simple question. "Is the house still in your name?" "Yes," I said. "It always has been." He asked me to bring the paperwork to his office the next morning. When he finished looking through every document, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Legally, this home is yours. If you want your son and his family to move out, you have every right to ask them to." Hearing those words didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel heartbroken. This wasn't the future my husband and I had imagined when we bought that house. Still, I knew pretending everything was fine wouldn't fix what had already been broken. That evening, I asked my son and daughter-in-law to sit down with me. I calmly told them I had decided it was time for them to find a place of their own. My son looked at me in disbelief. "Mom, you're serious?" I nodded. Before he could say anything else, my daughter-in-law gave a small laugh. "You're not actually asking us to leave," she said. "You're just upset." I looked at her and quietly replied, "I've never been more certain." The room fell silent. My son tried to reason with me. He reminded me how expensive houses had become and how hard it would be to move with 2 young children. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked him one question. "When she said, 'We live here now,' why didn't you correct her?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I had walked into that house years ago, he looked like the little boy who knew he had done something wrong. A week later, they packed their belongings and moved into a rental home nearby. I watched the moving truck pull away without saying a word. After the driveway was empty, I walked through every room of the house. The walls were quiet again, just as they had been after my husband passed away. Then I stopped in the hallway. Faint pencil marks were still on the wall where we had measured my son's height as he grew up. I gently ran my fingers across them and smiled through my tears. The next morning, a locksmith arrived. Less than an hour later, he handed me a brand new set of keys. I thanked him, closed the front door, and locked it. I had just reached the living room when someone knocked. It was my son. He looked at the new lock, then back at me. "Mom, you changed them?" he asked quietly. I looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm not locking you out. I'm finally letting myself back in." He lowered his head, and in that moment, I could see he finally understood. This had never really been about the house. My son stood on the porch for a long moment without saying anything. Finally, he looked up and asked, "Can we talk?" I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. A few minutes later, my daughter-in-law came walking across the street. She must have seen us from the rental house because she walked over without saying a word. None of us raised our voices. We didn't need to. The silence already carried enough weight. My son was the first to speak. "Mom, I thought you were upset about one comment." I slowly shook my head. "It wasn't one comment," I said. "It was the moment I realized you both had started living in my house, as if I no longer belonged there." My daughter-in-law looked down at the porch steps. "I never meant it that way," she whispered. "Maybe not," I replied gently. "But intentions don't erase the way someone feels." For the first time, neither of them tried to defend themselves. Then my son took deep breath and said something I never expected to hear. "The truth is, after so many years, I stopped thinking of it as your house. I started thinking of it as ours." He covered his face with one hand before continuing. "And I never noticed how wrong that was." My daughter-in-law's voice trembled as she spoke. "When I told my friend, 'We live here now,' I wasn't trying to push you out. But hearing those words back now, I can see that's exactly what they sounded like." Before I could answer, the front door of their rental house opened and my oldest grandson came running toward us. He looked from his parents to me with a confused expression. "Grandma," he asked, "why can't you come home anymore?" None of us answered. There wasn't an answer simple enough for a child. He looked at his father again and frowned. "Did Grandma do something bad?" My son's eyes filled with tears. He knelt down in front of his son and quietly said, "Nobody. Grandma didn't do anything wrong. We forgot that this was her home before it was ever ours." My grandson nodded slowly, thinking about his father's words. Then he looked at me again and smiled. "Can we still come visit you?" That simple question broke whatever was left of the anger in my heart. I smiled back and said, "My door will always be open to you." As my grandchildren hugged me goodbye, my son quietly asked if they could come back the following weekend. "Not to change your mind," he said, "just to keep talking." I looked at both of them for a long moment before giving a small nod. I wasn't ready to trust them again. But for the first time, I believed they finally understood that what they'd taken from me was never just a house. It was the feeling that I still belonged inside it. A week passed before my son called. His voice sounded different, quieter. He asked if they could stop by for a few minutes. I agreed, but I wasn't sure what to expect. When they arrived, my son carried a small box while my daughter-in-law followed behind with the children. No one rushed to explain themselves. No one asked if they could move back. My son placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside were the family photographs that had quietly disappeared from the walls months earlier. On top was the picture of my husband standing on the front porch the day we bought the house. "I found these in the closet," he said. "I should have put them back a long time ago." Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law gently set another box beside it. Inside were my sewing supplies. She looked at me and started to speak, then stopped. After a long silence, she quietly admitted, "I kept telling myself I was making the house more practical. I never stopped to ask who I was pushing aside." It wasn't a perfect apology. It was an honest one. Then my son looked around the room and shook his head. "I spent weeks telling myself this was all because of one sentence," he said. "It wasn't. We changed this house, little by little, until it stopped feeling like yours." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to argue about because the truth was finally sitting in the room with us. Over the next few weeks, things changed without anyone announcing they would. My son called. before coming over instead of letting himself in. My daughter-in-law asked before moving anything, even a small flower pot on the porch. Those little moments mattered more than big promises ever could because they showed respect instead of simply talking about it. Then one Saturday morning, they came over for breakfast. Out of habit, I walked towards the kitchen, already thinking about making coffee and setting the table. Before I reached the counter, my grandson smiled and pointed to my chair. "Grandma," he said, "you're not working today." I looked up. My son was making pancakes while my daughter-in-law poured juice for the children. The table was already set. Nobody had been waiting for me to do it. I sat down without saying a word. As I looked around the room, I realized something had finally changed. They no longer treated me like the person who kept the house running. They treated me like the person who made it a home. After breakfast, my family gathered at the front door. My daughter-in-law hugged me and quietly said, "I hope one day, when you think about this house, you remember more than the day we hurt you." I watched them walk down the front path together. Then I looked back inside. The walls hadn't changed. The furniture hadn't changed. But the feeling had. Because changing the locks had never been about keeping my family out. It had been about making sure respect found its way back in.